Palynology is the study of pollen grains, spores, dinoflagellates and other microscopic plankton, and sediments like charcoal. These studies are used to observe environmental and climate conditions over time because they preserve remarkably well in soil sediments. We collect palynomorphs by carefully extracting soil cores from the ground, then chemically treating them so that they can be mounted onto microscope slides. We use microscopes to identify pollen grains by their morphological characteristics, like surface texture and shape. The identified taxa are marked by the counter for further analysis. Even though pollen analysis is a useful method, some taphonomic conditions must be considered. For example, some plant species, like pine and spruce trees, naturally produce more pollen grains than others, or they are transported more effectively through the atmosphere or water. Likewise, some pollen grains are more poorly preserved in sediments. Salt marshes preserve pollen grain especially well due to their acidic quality. However, because they are tidal marshes, they contain pollen from local and distant sources. That's why it's important to know which pollen grains you would expect from these sources. Researchers use palynology to assess long-term density and spatial patterns of vegetation in order to understand human, climatic, or environmental patterns and impacts in the past. Researchers have used palynology for archaeological contexts, landscape management, and climate change studies. We use palynological techniques at the salt marsh on Chaleur Bay within the Daly Point Reserve in Bathurst, New Brunswick. We wanted to analyze the vegetation history of the area, so we chose to do a small-scale study of a tree to see if it grew in a terrestrial or freshwater wetland environment. We know that this tree currently occupies a salt marsh on Chaleur Bay. It was burnt on the inside and appears to be manually cut. We also know which kind of pollen grains designate a terrestrial or freshwater environment. We also know the local vegetation types around Bathurst, which helps us analyze which pollen grains come from local or distant sources. A palynological analysis revealed several different possible things about this tree and the surrounding environment's history. It appears that our sample is only about 100 years old. I began the analysis with a program called C2 to generate pollen stratigraphy graphs for pollen percentages and a scatter point graph for pollen concentrations. It is possible that the area began as an early successional forest that underwent an initial land clearing event from fires, seen with the high sum of charcoal here. This likely allowed the newly cleared area to sprout ragweed, or ambrosia-type grains, and sphagnum, a marina indicator. It also allowed a growth in early successional species like betula. Several similar disturbance events occurred, but it appears that the local forest structure underwent changes while the salt marsh vegetation increased. Over time, the arboreal species decline, except for Picea and Pinus. This leads to the conclusion that the early successional forest was overtaken by late successional species that better tolerate wetland soils and fire clearance events. Judging from the current forest population, these were probably black spruce trees. Their pollen might not have been in the direct vicinity of the sediment sample, but due to the pollen grain's physical structure, they can travel farther distances than insect-pollinated pollen grains. The growth of marine indicator microfossils in arboreal species, especially the wetland obligate and facultative plants, suggests that the salt marshes area grew over time. These events led to the present salt marshes environment, which consists of wetland vegetation, several dead trees, and a tree line farther away from the sample site. These conclusions are all hypothetical, due to several limitations from human counting error, the taphonomical processes in pollen preservation, and the fact that pollen comes from local and distant sources within a salt marsh. However, hopefully you can see that palynology has the potential to recreate historical vegetations and environments, which can answer further questions about the past plant diversity and human impacts upon the ecosystem.